Good evening, everyone. I'm Jill Max, a member of the Board of Trustees of the Jewish Museum of Maryland. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual presentation, White Supremacy in 2021, Putting Violent Extremists on Trial. This is the second in our two-part series, Confronting White Supremacy Yesterday and Today. We are very pleased to be partnering tonight with the Baltimore Jewish Council and the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. A special thanks goes to our generous donors for helping us to put on this important series. On Tuesday night, we explored the history of white supremacy within our country and the way in which anti-Semitism is built into that narrative. Tonight, we bring that conversation to the present and hear from Integrity First for America, who in partnership with a world-class legal team is taking on the individuals and hate groups at the center of the events that took place in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. They are working to hold accountable in federal court those individuals who brought violence to that city. Let me introduce you to our moderator today. Justin Fair works in the public sector as a project manager with the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development with the Small Cities team. He recently earned his master's degree in city and regional planning from Morgan State University. On the weekends, he works as vice president of Unmatched Athlete, a nonprofit he and his husband founded, planning pickup games for LGBTQ+ youth sports across the Baltimore, DC corridor. In addition, Justin is a board member of Mission Fit, a nonprofit that uses the power of training and exercise to empower Baltimore's youth. A man of many hats, Justin is a self-proclaimed know-it-all who immediately files everything away, including where he put his glasses. Looks like they're on your face right now, Justin. In his spare time, he channels his search for creative clarity at soulstrong.com. Justin is passionate and excited to support programs that merge Jewish values with community development, wellness, and self-empowerment. Justin will be in conversation with Amy Spitalnick, the executive director of Integrity First for America, the nonpartisan civil rights nonprofit that is backing the landmark federal lawsuit filed by a coalition of Charlottesville, Virginia community members against the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for the August 2017 violence. Amy joined IFA with extensive experience in government, politics, and advocacy, including her work as communications director and senior policy advisor to the New York Attorney General, communications advisor and spokesperson for the New York City Mayor, and communications director for the New York State Senate. She has also worked on a number of federal, state, and local campaigns and with advocacy organizations. Amy frequently appears in national media and has been awarded many fellowships and honors, including being named a Women in Power Fellow at the 92nd Street Y in New York, the Truman National Security Project Fellow, and a City and State 40 Under 40 Rising Star. Amy graduated from Tufts University. Before we hand it over to Justin and Amy, we are going to watch a short video from Integrity First for America that will remind us of the events that took place in Charlottesville. Please be aware that this film does contain some disturbing images and sounds.
Charlottesville. Stark displays of racism.
Trying to promote a car has rammed into a crowd.
Victims thrown in the air.
Deadly act of domestic terror.
One woman dead, others chosen wounded.
10 of the people who were injured in Charlottesville, including 3 of the people who were hit by that car and survived, have now brought a lawsuit against not only the murderer who drove his vehicle into the crowd, but also the leaders of all of the white nationalist groups that organized and promoted the Charlottesville event.
We are Integrity First for America. We are here to disrupt the extremism, to interrupt the cycle, to dismantle and bankrupt these hate groups and their leaders, to put them out of business, and most importantly, to stop the violence. Integrity First for America is leading the fight against white supremacy. Our Charlottesville lawsuit is the only current legal effort taking on the broad leadership of this movement, holding white supremacists accountable for their premeditated violence. We know that it's working. They're already facing huge financial and legal consequences. But we also know what we're up against. Bankrupting Nazis isn't cheap. These groups are still recruiting, weaponizing fear, and preparing for their next attack. Now more than ever, we are reminded of our obligation to dismantle the systems of white supremacy that poison this country. Turn your outrage into action, because hate has no place here.
Amy, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited that I get to ask some questions and you get to give some answers. And when we're done, we'll have a Q&A after. So let's dive into it. For those in the audience who might not be familiar with the case, could you give us an overview of the facts, who the plaintiffs are, what injuries they suffered, and who the defendants are, and what are they trying to accomplish?
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Justin and Jill and everyone who made tonight possible. Really honored to be here and looking forward to hopefully getting to do this in person with all of you at some point in the not too distant future. And I know that you had Eric Ward as part of this series earlier, and he's a fantastic partner of ours. And so always grateful to follow in his very, very impressive footsteps and partner with you all here. Look, I think it's really easy to forget that nearly 4 years ago in an American city, neo-Nazis and white supremacists were so emboldened, so empowered that they attacked that city and targeted people based on their race, their religion, and their willingness to defend the rights of others. But that's precisely what happened. First, on Friday, August 11th, 2017, I think many of us remember the visceral feeling of watching neo-Nazis carrying tiki torches, which they specifically chose to evoke the Nazis and the KKK, marching on the University of Virginia, chanting things like blood and soil, Jews will not replace us, white lives matter. They surrounded a small group of peaceful counter-protesters at the Thomas Jefferson statue in the middle of campus. They kicked, punched, beat them up, threw fuel and lit torches at them. One of our plaintiffs who was there that night, a Black undergraduate student at the university, said he thought he was going to die. And nearby, an interfaith gathering that had been created as a safe space for the community to come together with white supremacists descending on their town, ironically had to shelter in place because it was so unsafe outside their doors. The next day, Saturday, August 12th, I think we all know how the day culminated, sadly, in the car attack that killed Heather Heyer and injured so many of our plaintiffs. We saw some of that footage in the video just a few minutes ago. But it's really important to understand it was a day and a weekend of violence. It was a Saturday. And so the synagogue in downtown Charlottesville was celebrating Shabbat as they do every weekend. And these neo-Nazis marched on this time downtown Charlottesville under the guise of protesting the removal of the Robert E. Lee Confederate statue. But as we'll talk about tonight, that was never the real intention of the weekend. The intention was always violence. They marched on downtown Charlottesville violently, chanting, wreaking havoc wherever they went. And I think most notably, well, not most notably, but notably perhaps, is the fact that, as I said, it was a Shabbat and they surrounded the local synagogue, chanting things like Sieg Heil, carrying semi-automatic weapons, talking in their online chats about, quote, torching those Jewish monsters. And the synagogue had to evacuate congregants and Torah scrolls out the back. And the detail that always sticks with me, no matter how often I share it, how often I read it in our lawsuit, is that the synagogue was home to a Torah scroll saved from Nazi Germany decades ago. And in America in 2017, it was once again under Nazi threat. And that just sort of grabs me, no matter how often I share that detail. The violence continued. They charged a line of interfaith clergy who were peacefully protesting, including our plaintiff, Reverend Seth Wispelway. The Black neighborhoods in Charlottesville were specifically targeted as well, even long after the violence downtown subsided, and including with these white Mercedes vans that the white supremacists would drive around those neighborhoods specifically. And of course, the day ended in the car attack that killed Heather Heyer, injured so many of our plaintiffs, as you saw in that video. Folks like Marcus Martin, who was seen in that iconic Pulitzer-winning photo of the car going through the crowd. He sort of splayed across the back in a white shirt and red shoes. He pushed his then fiancee, now wife Marissa, out of the way, who is also a plaintiff in our suit. Both were grievously injured. Marcus's legs were shattered. They had a number of other injuries, never mind, of course, the psychological impacts. And our plaintiffs include a variety of other folks who you saw both in that video who were injured in the car attack, and some who were also injured on Friday night during the Tiki Torch violence on UVA's campus. And what's so important to understand about all of this is that nothing was an accident. Rather, it was meticulously planned for months in advance on social media, down to discussions of whether they could hit protesters with cars and then claim self-defense. And so that's not an accident. That's not a clash between opposing sides. That's a racist, violent conspiracy. And we have laws that are meant to protect against that. And so using those laws, we are taking to court the 24 individuals and groups most directly responsible for orchestrating that violence. The defendants are names and groups that I suspect you will all know, like Richard Spencer, Andrew Anglin, who runs the Daily Stormer, the country's leading neo-Nazi site, League of the South, Identity Europa, which is one of the most prominent white supremacist groups on college campuses. They now go by American Identitarian Movement. Vanguard America, which is the group that James Fields, who drove the car, was part of, and James Fields himself is also a defendant, and a variety of others. And while there were hundreds of extremists in Charlottesville that weekend, using the social media chats and other evidence we have that I'm sure we'll talk about in more detail, we specifically identified the ringleaders, the specific people and groups that really orchestrated and executed the violence that week, and are holding them accountable for that racist, violent conspiracy.
So glad to hear that it's about holding people accountable and getting angry. You referenced that these are very much neo-Nazis. I feel like we've had this chapter before in our history as Americans. Can you tell us about the legal theory of the case? And specifically, I read, you're using the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. We've had this before. So what's the history of the act, and has it been used frequently? It's been what, 150 years?
Exactly 150 years, almost to the date. The spring was 150 years since President Ulysses Grant signed the Ku Klux Klan Act into law. And so you're exactly right. We've seen this movie before. We know what we're talking about here. And it's fun. It's not funny that you say that, but it's sort of poignant that you say this, because so many scholars and other academics and experts who've been following what's happening in this country have in many ways compared this moment to the Reconstruction era. Just a few weeks ago, I did an event with the incredible Dr. Ibram Kendi, and he specifically talked about how this moment in so many ways feels like the Reconstruction era, in that there has been enormous progress made on a number of fronts, and the backlash to that progress, whether that progress be the first Black president, the fact that this country has really been meant to be a beacon for refugees and immigrants and others. There's obviously so much more work that needs to do. But part of the backlash to that progress, exacerbated by so many other factors that I'm sure we'll talk about tonight, has been this horrific rise in white supremacy and extremism. And the fact that we have to go back to a law passed 150 years ago in the aftermath of the Civil War to deal with the same sort of racist violence is a sad testament to the resurgence of extremism in this moment, but also the fact, in some ways, I think it gives me hope, because of the fact that we have tools to fight this, and they've been used in the past and we can use them now. The KKK Act was specifically created by the Reconstructionist Congress to give recently freed slaves a right of recourse, a way to fight back against Klan vigilantes who were terrorizing people in the South, Black people in the South, specifically to undermine their recently won 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment rights. These attacks on the recently freed slaves were in the form of these sorts of private, racist, violent conspiracies. So much of our civil rights law has to do with governmental action, what the government can and can't do in protecting our civil rights. This is one of the few statutes that has to do with private conduct and gives other private citizens a right of recourse against their fellow citizens and other private individuals who attack them and undermine their civil rights. And so, as I mentioned earlier, what happened in Charlottesville was planned meticulously in advance. The conspiracy among these individuals and groups is clear. We got a lucky break very early on in that the Discord chats, the social media chats on a site called Discord. Some of you might know Discord because you or your kids or someone might use it if you play video games or otherwise communicate. It's a normal mainstream social media site co-opted by these white supremacists to plan Unite the Right. And those Discord chats were leaked out through a nonprofit journalism outfit called Unicorn Riot in the days after the violence. And that lucky break that we had made clear very early on that what happened wasn't an accident, that it was planned, and gave us a huge amount of evidence before we were able to file our lawsuit. Normally you have to file a lawsuit and then you go through the discovery phase. And of course we've done that here, but we had this lucky break that really showed us just how well planned this all was even before we could actually file the suit. And that made clear the basis for this case, that this is a racist, violent conspiracy, that the KKK Act is meant to protect against exactly this sort of thing, and that our plaintiffs, who are a diverse coalition of Charlottesville community members targeted and violently attacked and injured in that violence, have the right to hold them accountable for that conspiracy, for that the ways in which their civil rights were undermined. And so I think as sort of sad and disturbing as it is that we need to use a law that's so old, it also gives me hope because we have these tools. We've used them in the past, including during the early 1900s when the Klan was resurgent, during the Freedom Rider era, and we are using this law now to fight back against resurgent white supremacy.
Is the act itself, even though it's named Ku Klux Klan, it's not only restricted to white supremacy, correct?
Like it's specific to racially motivated violent conspiracies. And so as I described, and as we saw, of course, many with our own eyes watching the news in 2017, the violence in Charlottesville wasn't just racist. Of course, it was racist. It was anti-Semitic. It was oftentimes homophobic, Islamophobic. And of course, a number of those forms of hate also fall under what the Ku Klux Klan Act is meant to cover, racially motivated extremism. And that includes not just racism against Black people and brown people, but also anti-Semitism, for example. And I think that's very important. And of course, I'm sure we'll continue to talk about this throughout the evening, but the ways in which what happened in Charlottesville, the ways in which white supremacy and its manifestation so illustrates how deeply interconnected our community's fates are right now. Quite literally, in this case, you can't take on racism without taking on anti-Semitism. You can't take on anti-Semitism without taking on the racism that was inherent in what we saw in Charlottesville and inherent in so much of the white supremacist and white nationalist violence we're seeing. And the KKK Act is meant to be a tool to protect against just that.
When you speak about like what's inherent and what tools we use nowadays, you said they got together on Discord. Can you talk about the role that social media plays, especially now that it's said and done? They're still going, right? Like, how does it work with their using social media now? Are they raising funds? Are funds being raised for the plaintiffs? How does that work?
All of the above. So I'll start by saying, I think, there's so much about the moment we're in that really contributed to this record level extremism that we're seeing. And I don't want to say there was only one factor at play here, but I think social media is by far the largest factor that has led to the rise of extremism in this moment and the ways in which these extremists have been able to communicate and continue a cycle of violence in which each attack is used to inspire the next one. And what's important to make clear here is that no social media site has any obligation to give a platform to extremism. That's not what the First Amendment says. The First Amendment says that all of us have a right to our beliefs and to express that belief. But no private company, which is any of these social media sites, has an obligation to give a platform to that belief, to give elevation, to give credence to that belief by allowing it to really be put out there and used to frankly recruit on these platforms. But that's exactly what's happened over the last few years, not just on fringe sites. There are countless fringe sites like Gab, Telegram, 4chan, 8kun that have built entire business models on platforming extremism and allowing it to thrive. But as I mentioned, the Charlottesville violence was planned on a mainstream site, Discord, and we all know, sadly, that extremism, disinformation, and harassment runs rampant on the sites that we all use too, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you can go on and on. And so I think it's important to be clear about what the obligations are for these social media sites, that none of them has an obligation under the First Amendment to give a platform to this hate. And in fact, they have ethical, moral, and other obligations, I would argue, under many of their own terms of service, to remove this extremism, harassment, and violence from their platforms. Charlottesville, in many ways, was one of the most obvious illustrations of how social media has been exploited, but it didn't start there. And the cycle of extremism that followed Charlottesville in so many ways really illustrates this, and even predates Charlottesville. Today, we are marking the anniversary of the Charleston white supremacist attack, in which Mother Emanuel Church was attacked by a white supremacist, and a number of Black parishioners were violently murdered. And it is 6 years since that attack, and it is no less horrific today, the same way that any of these other white supremacist attacks are no less horrific today. But they really illustrate how this cycle of violence continues, and specifically the role of social media, the ways in which the defendants in our lawsuit and other white supremacists really revere and celebrate the Charleston shooter. There was something called the Bowl Patrol that specifically celebrates his bowl cut, his bowl haircut, that a number of our defendants and other white supremacists have been connected to and a part of on social media, for example. Charlottesville, of course, really capitalized on the use of social media to bring people together who otherwise wouldn't have been able to connect. Previously, Klansmen would meet in small locations in the woods, and their hate and violence would be sort of limited to their geographic area. But social media has allowed these extremists to connect across the country, around the world, and in the case of Charlottesville, descend on American City. And the ways in which social media has become the Klandon of the 21st century is really just stunning. And it doesn't stop there. We know that, for example, the Pittsburgh shooter, who killed 11 Jews praying in synagogue 2.5 years ago, communicated with some of the Charlottesville leaders on Gab, which is another far-right social media site. The Christchurch shooter, who killed dozens and dozens of Muslims praying in 2 mosques in New Zealand 2 years ago, donated, of course, online through his following of them on social media, to 2 of our Charlottesville defendants, Richard Spencer and Andrew Anglin, and painted onto his gun a symbol called the hashtag, a white power symbol that had been popularized by another one of our defendants, Matthew Heimbach, all online, of course, or literally around the world. You see how this extremist cycle continues. And Christchurch was live streamed on Facebook, and in turn inspired the Poway Chabad attack that killed 1 and injured many others, the El Paso Walmart attack that specifically targeted the Latinx community there, and so on. And of course, with the Capitol attack not that long ago, we see the same ways in which social media was central, how the playbook seen in Charlottesville specifically was utilized there, and again, the centrality of social media. And so I think it's really crucial to understand the role social media has played, not just in specific incidents, specific attacks, but in perpetuating a cycle of extremism in which each attack inspires the next one, largely, almost entirely through communications on social media.
It seems like it's built in, but we can take it apart, we can take it out. So many of us, I think, have felt deep frustration. I mean, I don't have a word stronger. I don't have the right word, but frustration is a light way of describing it. There's a rising tide of racism, anti-Semitism, apathy in many ways that seems to be occurring. Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, Christchurch, those places are no different than where you and I live today. What can we do to fight back?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it's so easy to feel that way in this moment. And no one should feel badly about feeling that way. I think, I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and that's always been a big part of my identity, but never has that been such a clear part of my identity and the parallels that are easy to draw with the darkest parts of our history than the last few years. I mean, watching neo-Nazis attack an American city, chanting the same slogans that the Nazis in Germany chanted as they killed most of my family there, right? This is something that I think any of us, no matter who we are and our backgrounds, many of us have deep connections to the darkest parts of our history that we're seeing parallels with in this moment. And it is terrifying, and it can feel hopeless and you can feel helpless in many moments. But in many ways, I draw some hope and optimism from a key factor, which is that unlike my grandparents' generation, we live in a country that has a rule of law, that has a justice system, and we can use them. I think we have to fight like crazy to protect the rule of law and to make sure our justice system is one that works equitably and fairly for everyone, which it certainly does not right now. But we can also use those tools. We can use laws like the KKK Act. We can use our courts to fight back and ensure accountability, particularly in a moment when accountability has been so sorely lacking as it has over the last few years. And so that's precisely what we're doing in this lawsuit. It's about making sure that we are using the tools we have to take action and hold people accountable, even if, for example, we had a federal government not that long ago that didn't. Making sure that these extremists can't simply terrorize and violently attack a community without facing real consequences. And this is a civil lawsuit. And so while we can't necessarily put all of these defendants in jail as you can in a criminal case, although I will say some of them have been in jail because of how egregiously they've behaved and were found in contempt of court, while it is a civil suit, we can win huge financial judgments against these defendants and effectively bankrupt, disrupt, and dismantle them in a way that will have impacts that extend well beyond Charlottesville on the movement because of their centrality, as I described earlier, and also in the deterrent effect that that will have to make sure any extremist who is watching knows the very severe consequences for being a part of this sort of racist, violent conspiracy. And so we're not powerless, we're not helpless in a moment like this. It just requires using the tools we have, finding the tools we have, going back 150 years as we did in this case. And of course, our case isn't a silver bullet. There's so much more that needs to happen here, including governmental action on all levels, including the private sector and tech companies in particular, including community work, de-radicalization work. But this is one very specific way that we can take concrete, tangible action in ensuring accountability and justice at a moment when it has been so lacking.
I see that in your argument, you very clearly are able to note the timeline between this and other incidents like January 6th. Are we just assuming there's a rise, or is there more activity happening? And to that note, is there more protections happening as well? Or are we able to dismantle those protections and protect ourselves instead?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we all know anecdotally that there has definitely been a rise in extremism, right? Like any of us who are watching what's happened in this country, and specifically people who don't rather present as white, are especially, I'm sure, and not to assume, but I can imagine, based on everything I have heard from friends and colleagues, that you know it in your bones. You know it, that this is real and it is happening. But you don't have to rely on anecdotes, and you don't have to rely on feelings to know that this is true. Every statistic backs this up. Every report from the government and from NGOs backs this up. We know that 2019 was the deadliest year on record for hate crimes. We know that domestic terror and extremism has hit record levels in recent years, the highest ever level since 1995, which was the year of the Oklahoma City bombing, another white supremacist attack. We know that anti-Semitic incidents have hit record levels. And of course, we all have particularly watched an alarming rise in anti-Semitic incidents over the last few months. Of course, anti-Asian incidents, anti-Black incidents, you can go on and on, the communities that are being targeted in this moment, both in terms of the larger scale attacks, but also the hate crimes and other hate incidents that we're seeing on a sadly daily basis in cities around this country. And so every statistic backs this up. And also the intelligence agencies are all telling us what we all know to be true, that white supremacy is the most persistent and lethal threat to our country. It isn't just the Biden administration. Under Donald Trump, the Department of Homeland said that white supremacy is the most persistent and lethal threat to this country. Of course, there were political actors who tried to bury that, who tried to distract and deflect by talking about Black Lives Matter or Antifa or any other red herring that they'll create, the current one being critical race theory. But we need to keep our eye on the ball. We need to be clear that every expert is telling us the gravest threat to our security, our national security on the domestic level, is white supremacy and other forms of far-right extremism. And it's crucial that we recognize that. Just this week, the Biden administration announced a 4-pillared plan to begin to invest in combating extremism on a variety of different fronts. And that's a really important first step, but there's so much more that needs to be done.
I always like to note, there's been no better time in history than today. We have more protections and more liberties and more technological advances that help our society. But it comes with this ugly flip side. As a legal case, you said this is a civil case. Part of me wonders, if it wasn't for your firm, where would we be in response to this terror? And how did this, so I guess my question is, how did the idea of trying to bankrupt these actors, how did that happen?
Yeah, well, I'm incredibly fortunate to work with some of the most brilliant attorneys in the business. And that includes Roberta Kaplan, who some of you might know for her work representing Edie Windsor in a Supreme Court case that struck down the Defense of Marriage Act 2013. So 8 years ago at this point. And Karen Dunn, who's a former federal prosecutor in Virginia, former White House counsel, another brilliant attorney, and so many others who have really been at the forefront of a variety of different legal fights directly connected to this sort of work. And so when Charlottesville happened, I think our team was watching like the rest of the world in horror and in shock, but it was also very clear to Robbie and to others that what happened wasn't an accident and that there needed to be accountability, and that particularly the Department of Justice under then Jeff Sessions, who was the AG at the time, was unlikely to be the entity bringing that sort of accountability and justice, to put it lightly. And of course, that has borne out to be true, unfortunately. And so our team, Robbie and others, were on the ground in Charlottesville within days, talking to folks about what happened, hearing their stories. And so many of those people are now our plaintiffs. And it became clear, both from the social media chats that leaked and from hearing from the victims, that what happened was this sort of racist, violent conspiracy. And Robbie and our legal team were able to look back at our civil rights laws and find this Ku Klux Klan Act statute that in many ways, as old as it is, feels like it was exactly designed to take something like this on, in addition to other federal and state laws and statutes that are part of our lawsuit. And so within 2 months of the violence, our team, so our incredible legal team on behalf of our plaintiffs and funded by and supported by IFA, Integrity First for America, were in court filing this lawsuit. It has not been a fast or an easy path, as you could imagine. We are now nearly 4 years out from Unite the Right. And when we go to trial this fall, it will be 4 years from when we filed the lawsuit. But we have seen so much more accountability that otherwise would have happened. This is really the only legal effort taking on the broad leadership of this movement right now. And particularly, I think the ways in which this case has really become a model for accountability at a moment when it's sorely lacking. January 6th, of course, has resulted in, I think, upwards of 500 different individuals charged by the Department of Justice for their involvement. And that is night and day from what we saw after Charlottesville. At the same time, of course, there are also these civil cases being brought in the aftermath of January 6th, some of them using the KKK Act, and the ways in which our case can really be a model for that sort of accountability and justice at a moment, again, when it's so sorely needed, has been heartening. And the ways in which it's already had major impacts on the defendants, including, to quote Richard Spencer, financially crippling him, is equally heartening.
So Richard Spencer is just one man. We have had lots of leaders over our time on this earth, and we've had lots of bad actors. I'm worried that there's going to be another Richard Spencer that will pop up. You said this is an example, this is a model case. Well, unfortunately, we have many other examples of terrible cases that need to be taken to effect. And I'm glad that this, as a civil action, is recognizing how to sort of get around the system, but work within the system. to target the people and not allow a scapegoating response to take place. You had said that especially with Ms. Kaplan, that you all were watching. At the same time, it makes me think, now that this is happening, there are people watching you. Can you speak to the types of threats, to the examples of courageous praise that your firm has received since beginnings?
Thanks. Look, I think, this is always the part of an event where I wonder if my mother is watching, because I don't want her to be. It's the least pleasant part of this work. And I feel very honored and grateful to get to do this work and to work with such an incredible legal team on behalf of our really brave plaintiffs who survived the unthinkable and channeled it into this.
It's their hometown.
Yeah, it's their hometown was under attack. And in some cases, these are people who were lifelong Charlottesville residents, students, undergrads, law students. It's horrific. And the fact that they chose to go this path, which hasn't been fast, hasn't been easy, but will have impacts that extend well beyond their community and finally win accountability for their community when it's been so sorely lacking is I just am so inspired by them. But to your point, the defendants and their supporters don't like that they're being held accountable. And have used every trick in the book to try to avoid that accountability. The court has rejected all of the legal maneuvers they've tried, whether it be their motions to dismiss, claiming bankruptcy, trying to block subpoenas, trying to just destroy or withhold evidence. And in many cases, they've actually been sanctioned and faced very large financial and legal consequences, with even one already sitting in jail and a bench warrant out for another's arrest, which is really extraordinary in a piece of civil litigation like this. But one of the other tools that they and their supporters use is the threat of violence and harassment to try to avoid accountability. And so in some cases, the defendants themselves are targeting us, like Chris Cantwell, who is one of the defendants. If you saw the Vice documentary on Charlottesville, he's the crying Nazi. He specifically talked about all the fun he was going to have with our attorney, Robbie Kaplan, when this is over, using far more vile, violent, and anti-Semitic and misogynistic language. Some of the defendants have talked about how I should be scared of them, have tried to target me at my home, have sat sort of live streaming at all hours of the day talking about us. And the threat there is, in more ways, even more than their own capacity for violence, which we know to be real, as we saw in Charlottesville, is their ability to rile their loyal followers to action on social media, to encourage their followers to turn these threats, to turn this harassment, to turn this extremism into real world action. And so, to be completely frank, security is the biggest line item in IFA's budget. We have lawyers who are generously donating so much time and work and energy to this case, millions upon millions of dollars in pro bono legal work. And for that, we are grateful. But security has been the biggest cost for us because of these threats against us, our lawyers, and our plaintiffs. And it means both monitoring for the threats on a daily basis and also making sure that our team is safe when we're on trial for weeks at a time this fall. And so folks should know that if you choose to support Integrity First for America, it directly funds those crucial case needs, including and especially security, which is the biggest item in our budget.
It makes me think that you can't just hide your head in a hole and you can't just squirrel yourself away. It makes me feel for you in that you want to keep the work going. And you want to, and you're readying up for this fight. At the same time, you have to strategize moving forward. How can we as supporters of you, or we as people who are just going to follow you in the news, what can we do? And how can we make sure that our actions locally are helping you nationally?
Well, there's so much that folks can do. And to your point, this isn't just a national issue. This just isn't just an issue for the courts. There's so much that people can do. To start, of course, if you're inspired and want to get involved with this specific litigation with our Charlottesville case, you can get involved through Integrity First for America. I think we're putting some links in the chat. You can sign up for case updates at integrityfirstforamerica.org. And as we head to trial this fall, we're going to be keeping you all apprised of what's happening so that you could closely follow the case. If you're inclined to donate, please know, again, it directly supports crucial case needs like security and evidence collection, and we're a nonpartisan 501c3, so it's tax deductible. And there's also information on our website, like an activist toolkit, a clergy toolkit, other tools that folks can use to spread the word to their communities, to make sure that people know that there's this concrete, tangible way to take action. But more broadly, though, we're facing this extremist crisis right now, the crisis of extremism. And we can't let this fall off the radar screen when the news cycle moves on. When the next attack happens, the news will cover it for a few weeks and then we'll move on again. And we can't keep going through that cycle. We need to make sure that this is staying front and center, not just for federal officials, holding our federal officials accountable to their obligations here to make sure that we're protecting against extremism and doing so in a way that continues to protect our civil liberties, state and local governments that have a responsibility to track and prosecute hate crimes effectively, to make sure that we have the tools to fight against hate on the local level, the private sector and tech companies in particular not giving a platform to extremism, investing in NGOs and others that are doing the important education and de-radicalization work. There's so much more that needs to happen, but I think, again, we are not powerless. And on the local level, there's so much that can be done to hold our officials account, hold the private sector account, support these non-governmental efforts, whether it be through IFA or the many other partner organizations we work with. So really, frankly, the fact that folks are taking an hour out of their evenings to learn tonight is such a crucial step. And for that, I'm grateful.
You said there's an activist toolkit. I know for me, especially as a man of color, I'm often skeptical of donating to causes to be frank, those with power fighting those with power. I myself am skeptical because I just have to walk out the door, and today might be the day that my name might be on the news. And so it's hard for me to think of a larger issue when in my backyard there are people. I live here in Baltimore. There are people who just look the wrong way, and before you know it, now they're on the ground with handcuffs behind their back. My brother is a cop. I know how it works on both ends, and it makes it very hard for me to see beyond my scope, my circle. You spoke about your activist toolkit. How has that been vetted? Is that just a collection of recommendations, or are there endorsements to it?
Yeah, frankly, it's a simple way for folks to just spread the word about this lawsuit, but we do work very closely with a number of other organizations doing critical work in this space. And I'm sure, as Eric Ward discussed when he spoke with all of you the other night, I think it's important to understand the ways the systems of white supremacy work. The violent extremism that we're seeing manifested in Charlottesville and Charleston, Pittsburgh, Poway, and so on are really sort of the tip of the iceberg of broader systems of white supremacy that extend down, of course, through our law enforcement, our justice system, all of the institutions, because in our society, because it's the system on which this country was built. And so even as we use some of these systems like our justice system to fight back against extremism, we must constantly be working to ensure that they actually work equitably, fairly for everyone. And that includes not just law enforcement, not just our justice system, but the whole sort of kit and caboodle of our infrastructure that is deeply built on the very systems. And so we work closely with groups like Western States Center, like SPLC, like the Anti-Defamation League, a variety of others that are doing different works in different parts of this space to ensure that we're not just taking on extremism as it manifested in Charlottesville, but that the work that we're doing is complementary to so much more that needs to happen in taking on the systems of white supremacy.
Okay. So yeah, let's take it on. Amy, let's transition over to the Q&A, and folks in the audience, those of you on Zoom, you should see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please submit questions. If you're on Facebook, you can leave those in the comment section and they will get to me through the magic of technology. So let's start off. Lynn, you're first in line. Is there a concerted effort to squash the various state legislative proposals that absolve the drivers who ran over protesters?
this is one of the more there's so much disturbing stuff happening on the state levels these days in terms of extremism, in which many conservative far-right state legislators are trying to give cover to extremism. And some state legislators themselves, of course, were participants on January 6th. And it's really important to understand the ways in which state legislatures have become sort of hotbeds of extremism, the institutional ways in which white supremacy and other forms of extremism are being perpetuated in a formal institutional way again. And one of those is through the laws that were just referenced. For folks who don't know, specifically Florida and some other states have passed laws that are intended, they call them anti-riot laws, but what these laws are really intended to undermine the free speech and right to protest of, for example, and especially Black Lives Matter protests. They were a direct response to the racial justice protests last summer, oftentimes with conservatives using boogeymen of Black Lives Matter and Antifa and others to say that there needs to be stronger protections to protect against rioting. One of the core components of some of these laws is to give legal cover to drivers who drive their cars into protesters. And there have been a number of reports in recent years, including last summer. NPR and others have done extensive reporting on this about how car attacks on protesters have increased exponentially in recent years. Of course, that was the centerpiece of what happened in Charlottesville. And as I mentioned in the chats before Unite the Right, the defendants and others were talking about things like, is it legal to run over protesters with your car in Virginia? It might be legal in other states. And now we're seeing states actually turn that into law, including, as I mentioned, Florida being one of the most recent ones. I believe Tennessee is also, and a number of others that have bills pending. And these laws are so dangerous in so many ways, but largely because what they do is give cover to extremists who are using an increasingly prevalent white supremacist tactic, which is car attacks, to undermine people's civil rights, to violently attack them for exercising their right to protest and to exercise their free speech. For sort of a far-right extremist movement that has been so focused on how they are being canceled, their free speech rights are being undermined, we now are seeing many of them trying to give cover to extremists who use violence to directly undermine people's civil rights. And the hypocrisy there is stunning, never mind how dangerous that is. So there are a number of efforts on a variety of levels. I know many organizations on the state level have been fighting these bills like crazy, including the ACLU and others. There are groups like Future Now that work with state legislators to help ensure that they have tools to actually introduce good legislation and fight bad legislation on this front, and a variety of other organizations. Whether or not it's as organized and concerted of an effort as I wish it were is probably a different story. But I think we need to be awake to how white supremacy manifests, not just in the violent attacks that we're talking about tonight, but in giving institutional cover in the ways that these bills intend to do, particularly at a moment when this sort of tactic is on the rise. And so it's so important that we be aware of it, that we call it out, and that we work on every level of government to help stop these bills where we can.
Yeah. Next question, Richard asks, has the KKK Act been used successfully in any recent cases, like some of the examples you provided?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, this law has not been used very frequently, but it has certainly been used in key moments where similar rises in violent extremism, violent racism were happening. And most notably during the Freedom Rider era. And the core precedent in our case that's cited in the papers that ultimately led to the rejections of the defendant's motions to dismiss. It's a case called Griffin v. Breckenridge, which emerged from that era and specifically had to do with a racist violent conspiracy against freedom riders, against people who were exercising their rights to advocate for justice and equality and during the civil rights era. And so there is certainly a strong precedent there. The fact that this law hasn't been used very, very often is, again, a sad testament to the moment that we're living in and how both disturbing this moment is, but again, the ways in which we have tools to fight back.
When we talk about the moment, it makes me think of how 2020 and 2021 are becoming one giant moment because of the pandemic. At the start of the year, Mark asks if your firm is doing anything about the January 6th attack. And since there's some similarities between that and Charlottesville, are they the same people?
It's a great question. It was very clear as January 6th was unfolding just how closely it followed the Charlottesville playbook. And in fact, we wrote an op-ed to that effect in the days after January 6th, talking about how the Capitol insurrection really did follow the Charlottesville playbook to a T. And what we're now seeing as these additional charges come out from the Department of Justice against many of the insurrectionists is even more so how the parallels that exist, the use of social media, the use of supposed free speech instruments as weapons like flagpoles. I think there was actually just a video released today of a former NYPD officer who was an insurrectionist using a flagpole violently. It was released by DOJ today, I think at the behest of a number of media organizations that filed perhaps a FOIA, Freedom of Information request. So many other parallels, including, I think it's worth noting, the ways in which the ideology are similar. And so we saw January 6th really illustrate both two things. One, the ways in which the extremist playbook has continued to was used both in Charlottesville and in the Capitol, but also how this movement has evolved. And so whereas in Charlottesville, many of the people involved were affiliated with specific extremist groups, what we saw at the Capitol is how extremism has become mainstreamed, how many of the people there were not participating as formal white supremacist organizations, but were there because of the disinformation and the extremism that they've been fed a steady stream of over the last few years. And while the ideology and the people have evolved, I think at the core of the ideology is the same sort of replacement theory, this idea of this white supremacist conspiracy that we've seen through so many of the extremist actions over the last few years. In Charlottesville, when they chanted Jews will not replace us, that specifically refers to the idea of Jews serving as puppet masters, orchestrating the replacement of the white race through supporting Black communities, brown communities, refugees, immigrants. The idea that none of these communities are capable of the success they've had on their own, and that there has to be a Jewish puppet master behind them pulling the strings. And it's the same conspiracy theory we saw in Pittsburgh, where that synagogue was chosen because of its work with HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, in Poway, in El Paso, in Christchurch. And it was inherent in the ideology we saw at play at the Capitol, where they said, "Stop the steal," referring to this country being stolen from white people. And so I think it's really important to understand that, to call that out, the ways in which this white supremacist conspiracy has become increasingly mainstream, not just because Tucker Carlson is now giving it a primetime audience, talking about it in very explicit terms during his show, but also because we're seeing more subtle iterations of it. When you hear about George Soros supposedly funding the Black Lives Matter protests or funding a caravan coming up from Central America, that also is a replacement theory. And those are the sorts of talking points you hear from increasingly mainstream officials on the Republican side. And so it's really important that we understand and identify how extremism is becoming mainstreamed. The Capitol attack was sadly the natural culmination of that, but it also, I think, is a preview of what we have to deal with and fight against in the coming years.
I think about the fact that we as Jews like to deal with truth, but we also like to deal with anecdotes, midrash, ways in which we can relate and give similarity. Unfortunately, we've seen, pogroms, I would think of as one of the most recent examples that led up to the Holocaust. It makes me angry. And it makes me concerned, especially with that notion of how we, as spectators in some ways, and then as actors, it might, how we will ourselves respond if this happens in our backyard, in our city. To our Q&A, Bob asks, can you tell us about the timeline of your lawsuit? And do you think your lawsuit will be affected if something else happens between now and it's getting and the fall?
Yeah, so we are scheduled to go to trial this October in Charlottesville currently. In Virginia, it will be in Virginia regardless. We hope in Charlottesville as the court originally intended. And October 25th is the exact date. And as I mentioned, it will be over 4 years since Unite the Right happened and nearly exactly 4 years from when we actually filed this lawsuit. So it has not been a fast path. It has not been an easy path, but we are finally in this pre-trial moment and prepared to go to trial this fall. And the impacts that we've seen even before trial have been very heartening, not just Richard Spencer complaining that it's financially crippling, defendants saying that they can't go about their business because of our suit, some saying they weren't going to return to Charlottesville for 3.0 as they were intending to do in 2018. We see the deterrent effect this can have, the financial, legal, operational impacts. And so when we go to trial and win large financial judgments against these defendants from a jury, we can effectively bankrupt and dismantle these groups and their leaders, follow them around for the rest of their lives, collecting on those judgments and making sure that they can't do this again. Not just they themselves through the impact this will have on them, but also the deterrent effect we hope this has on the broader movement. There's so much more that needs to happen, as I said, but we think that this case has already had a really crucial impact on these leaders and the broader movement, and that when we go to trial and have that accountability, have a jury of Virginia residents hold these extremists accountable for the violence, the racism, the hate that they brought to Charlottesville 4 years ago, that will be incredibly powerful for, again, the accountability that's been lacking, the deterrent effect that we need. And also, I think the trial itself, there has always been a trial every few years in this country that has been about more than the parties. It's been about a national reckoning, the public consciousness needing to be woken up to something, whether it be the Prop 8 case on marriage equality in California or so many others going back. And I think that this can be that trial helping to wake the country up to the crisis of extremism and making clear the consequences for this sort of violent hate.
Yeah, Amy, it's 8:30. Looks like we've got to go. Jillian, would you mind hopping on board?
Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much for just such a fascinating conversation. I feel like I learned an immense amount, and it was also, I hope for those that are able to join us for both nights, it feels like we kind of got a rounded out story there and can really understand a bigger picture. So just to wrap us up this evening, I just want to take a moment, if everyone will bear with me, to thank everyone who has been involved in putting this event together, or this pairing of events together. So from the Baltimore Jewish Council, I'd like to thank Matt, Howard, and Emily. From the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education, I'd like to thank Judy, Becca, and Amber. From IFA, I would like to thank Ben and Adina, and also so much thank you, Amy, as well, for joining us. Justin, thank you for moderating this evening. And Jill, thank you for getting us started this evening. I'm going to ask a colleague now to work on dropping a few links into the chat for you. We're going to drop in links where you can learn about all of the presenting organizations. And also I'm going to ask Ben if he can drop in some info as well about how you can connect with IFA. And then finally, hopefully, Laura, I'm not going too fast. If I can also ask you to drop in a link, she's already there, the link to the recording that's now available on our website from Tuesday night. And I realize, I'm sorry, Laura. Thank you, Laura from the JMM as well, for everything you have done in getting us here. There is absolutely no way we'd be here were it not for you. And so with that, just one last reminder to everyone. As you exit there, you will be redirected to a survey. If you can please take a minute to share your thoughts and your responses, it really, really does help us in our planning process. And so with that, just thank you again to everyone involved, especially Justin and Amy. Thank you for joining us this evening. Everyone, have a good night, and we hope to see you again very, very soon. Thank you.